Welcome to TN Shadow Stories. Tonight, we'll step into the shadows of Ellsworth, where old cornfields whisper ancient secrets and the night conceals a chilling truth. Ethan, a teenager burdened by memories, seems to be drawn towards something unseen, something without eyes. Is it an ancient curse, or merely the delusion of a tormented mind? Let's find out if light can truly banish the darkness that haunts him, or if the echoes from the past will forever imprison Ethan's soul. Autumn of 1998 saw a melancholic, yellowed curtain fall over the town of Ellsworth, Iowa. The dry cornfields whispered in the wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. For 26-year-old Abigail Gray, a young widow with sorrowful blue-gray eyes, Ellsworth was not just her hometown, but the last place she could hope to find some peace after tragedy. Her husband, Benjamin Gray, a robust man with a gentle smile, was gone forever. The horrific traffic accident occurred one fateful early morning on a winding mountain road deep in Colorado. The company's delivery truck, overturned in a deep ravine, was disfigured beyond recognition. When the rescue team found Benjamin, his body was wedged in the cab, his face unrecognizable, a haunting image forever etched in Abigail's mind. The shock was too great, the pain too unbearable, pushing Abigail to the brink of collapse. After a hasty funeral in cold Denver, she decided to pack everything, clutching her 6-year-old son, Ethan, and return to her parents' old house in Ellsworth. The house was tucked away behind ancient maple and oak trees, near the Elmwood Field on the eastern side of town. The old 2-story wooden house, with its rusted, mottled tin roof and walls covered in lush green ivy, stood like a silent ghost amidst the vast rural landscape. It was quite isolated from the main residential area of Ellsworth, hundreds of meters away from the nearest neighbors. Behind the house lay a vast expanse of reeds, where the wind whistled day and night, creating a mournful symphony of nature. The surrounding area was always so quiet that one could clearly hear the dry leaves falling onto the roof, or the chirping of insects beneath the withered grass. Abigail was an only child. Her parents had passed away a few years prior. Now, in this world, she had only Ethan in the first days back. Mother and son lived in silence and sorrow. Grief seemed to have become an invisible member of their family, enveloping every corner of the house. Ethan, a fair-haired boy with clear blue eyes, often looked at his mother with a confused and worried gaze. He didn't fully understand what death was, but he sensed the deep sadness weighing on his mother every day. Before preparing dinner, Abigail carefully set a small meal on the old oak altar where a time-faded wedding photo of her and Benjamin now hung, their happy smiles frozen in the past. She taught Ethan how to clasp his hands, bow his head, and whisper for his father to come home for dinner, according to the ancient custom of this rural area. This ritual would last for 49 days, the period during which the deceased's soul lingered in the mortal world, not yet fully departed. Abigail hoped that by doing this, Benjamin's soul would find peace and soon pass on. During the day, Abigail tried to pull herself together to tend to the small vegetable garden behind the house, weeding and tilling the soil, as a way to keep herself busy and not drown in grief. She quietly repaired the rotten wooden planks on the old porch, cleaning the time-worn house. She wanted to create a warmer space for Ethan, a place where he could grow up without the heavy burden of his father's sorrow. But night was a different story, as darkness fell, enveloping the house and the field behind it. A heavy, gloomy atmosphere began to seep into every nook and cranny. The house began to emit strange, unexplainable sounds. Soft, hurried footsteps echoed in the attic, a place no one ever went. As the stairs were rotted and carefully barricaded, the back door would mysteriously unlatch and slam shut on windless nights, creating eerie, hollow sounds. Abigail told herself she was too stressed, that these were just the creaks of an old house, or perhaps rats. But as the days passed, these phenomena became clearer, more frequent, and harder to ignore. She began to see faint shadows flitting past her vision, fleeting like illusions. The scent of Benjamin's cologne sometimes wafted through the air, only to vanish instantly. Fear began to creep into Abigail's mind. She worried for her sanity, and most of all, she feared these strange occurrences would affect Ethan, a child too young to confront supernatural phenomena after several sleepless nights. She decided to seek help. She invited Mrs. Edna Harper, an elderly neighbor, over 60, with neatly tied white hair and keen eyes, to stay for a few nights. Mrs. Edna was a special figure in Ellsworth, having worked as a nurse at the town church in her youth, and was known for her belief in the afterlife. She had told stories of strange phenomena she had witnessed, and always carried an old oak crucifix in her pocket. Like a protective charm, Mrs. Edna's presence brought some comfort to Abigail, at least. She no longer had to face these strange things alone. Mrs. Edna showed no surprise at Abigail's stories. She just listened intently, nodding and occasionally gently stroking the crucifix in her pocket. She believed that something was disturbing the house, and it might be related to Benjamin's sudden passing. On the 7th night since Benjamin's death, the real nightmare began. It was a moonless night, the sky a thick, inky black. The wind was unusually still, not a single leaf stirred. Only the regular clatter of a dry branch tapping against the kitchen window, like a rhythm signaling ill omen. The old wall clock in the house read 11:57 p.m. Abigail and Mrs. Edna were still in the kitchen, armed with brooms and candles, patiently chasing away the rats from the cellar that incessantly scurried. Their scratching and scuttling sounds beneath the floorboards and behind the walls were clearly audible in the silent space, making the atmosphere even more tense. In his first-floor bedroom, Ethan was sound asleep in his small bed, wrapped tightly in his warm blue wool blanket. The bed was placed right next to the window. The faint moonlight from the gap in the curtain streamed in, casting a weak, ethereal glow on the boy's innocent face. Suddenly, Ethan's eyes snapped open, not because he was awakened by a sound, but as if something, an invisible force, had called him from the other side. His pupils dilated in the darkness, his eyes staring blankly into the void before him. Outside the window where one could look directly out onto the vast, desolate Elmwood field. Shrouded in deep night, a voice spoke. A hoarse, deep voice, carrying a chillingly eerie yet strangely familiar resonance. "Come here with me, Ethan. Let's switch places." The voice was not a whisper, but a resonant sound, as if it emanated from within the boy's own mind. Ethan sat bolt upright, his eyes wide and vacant, his face expressionless, his voice murmuring, repeating each word as if mesmerized. "Let's switch places. Let's switch places." From downstairs in the kitchen, Mrs. Edna suddenly snapped her head up. Her silver hair seemed to stand on end. Her face turned pale as if drained of blood, her lips tightly pressed. "What was that sound?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Edna didn't answer, only mumbled, her voice faint, almost inaudible. "That's the sound of the dead." Then, as if jolted awake, Mrs. Edna immediately grabbed the oak crucifix from her pocket. clutched it tightly in her hand, and without hesitation, rushed up the stairs. Abigail ran after her, her heart pounding in her chest. An overwhelming sense of dread enveloped her, a fear she had never experienced, far surpassing the grief of losing her husband. When they reached Ethan's bedroom, the sight before them froze the blood in Abigail's veins. Ethan was sitting upright in bed, his back perfectly straight, his eyes still ghostly white, endlessly repeating the eerie phrase, "Around the boy." The air became strangely cold, as if an invisible layer of ice had encased him. Their breaths turned into faint white mist in the cold air of the room. As Abigail lunged to hug her son, she suddenly froze. Her gaze inadvertently swept past the gap in the window, and she saw a shadow, the shadow of a man, tall, standing motionless in the dense blackness of the wild field, like a monument of darkness. That form, it was unmistakable. It was Benjamin, his familiar silhouette. The robust build she still remembered, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. Abigail's fear reached its peak. The shadow's face had no eyes, only two deep, dark hollows, like abysses of death. From its ethereal body, wisps of faint gray smoke rose, swirling in the cold air, and then, in an instant, the black shadow vanished like a gust of wind passing through a wall, dissolving into nothingness. At the same moment, Ethan convulsed violently, his whole body stiffened, sweat pouring from him, soaking his nightshirt. The boy seemed to be torn by something invisible. Mrs. Edna approached, her face grim. She jammed the oak crucifix onto Ethan's headboard, right above his pillow. The single candle flame in the room flickered wildly, as if blown by an invisible force, then suddenly extinguished, leaving the room in complete darkness. The air became thick, carrying the smell of cold ash and the chill of death. Mrs. Edna did not flinch. She pulled a small vial from her pocket. It was holy water blessed by Father Martin at St. Jude's Church. She quickly uncapped it, sprinkling holy water throughout the room, especially around Ethan's bed. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, vade retro Satana. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Get behind me, Satan. Mrs. Edna began to chant in Latin, her voice deep and authoritative, echoing in the dark night. Abigail clutched her son, trembling. Ethan was now as if stretched and torn by something invisible. His arms were pulled taut to the sides, his legs jerking uncontrollably. On his small forehead, tiny drops of blood began to seep out as if someone's sharp fingernails had brutally scratched ancient symbols. An invisible shriek, not emanating from any visible being, echoed in the room. The wind gusted through the room even though the window was closed, sweeping everything off the dresser, making the curtains billow as if someone were tearing them apart. And then Ethan let out a piercing scream, his whole body shaking violently, before suddenly collapsing into his mother's arms, completely motionless. He gasped for breath, his eyes glistening with tears. His face was pale and sickly with terror. "Mommy, I saw Dad. Dad was in the field, but he had no eyes. He was so cold," Ethan whispered, his voice weak, his sobs choking him. Abigail held her son tight, her own tears flowing. She stroked Ethan's disheveled hair, whispering comforting words. Mrs. Edna sighed with relief, but her face still bore a deep, lingering worry. She knew that what had just happened was no coincidence, that entire night. The three of them sat quietly in Ethan's bedroom, candles lit until dawn. Abigail didn't sleep, her eyes never leaving her son for a second, as if afraid that something would return and take him again, and Mrs. Edna, clutching the oak crucifix, still murmured prayers, her eyes constantly vigilant, scanning every corner of the room. She believed that Benjamin's soul had been corrupted or exploited by another force. The next morning, sunlight peeked through the window, dispelling some of the darkness and cold of the night. But the atmosphere in the house still heavy with fear. Abigail and Mrs. Edna decided to invite the town's priest, Father Martin Blackwell, to perform a house cleansing. Father Martin was an old priest, with a head of white hair and eyes full of kindness, always trusted by the people of Ellsworth. When Father Martin arrived, he entered the house with a somber expression. He sensed a cold and heavy presence pervading the space. After hearing Abigail and Mrs. Edna recount the events of the previous night, he nodded, his face clearly showing concern. Father Martin began the cleansing ritual. He held a small silver vessel containing holy water, sprinkling it throughout the rooms, reciting solemn prayers. As he sprinkled holy water around the small altar where Benjamin and Abigail's wedding photo was placed, something strange happened. The wedding photo, which had been securely on the altar, suddenly shook violently, then fell, shattering into many pieces. Abigail and Mrs. Edna gasped when they looked down. A horrifying sight met their eyes. In the shattered wedding picture, Benjamin's face had become frighteningly blurred, only a faint, indistinct shadow remained, standing beside Abigail with a sinister smile. Benjamin's eyes in the photo had transformed into two deep, dark hollows, exactly like the shadow Abigail had seen outside the window last night. Father Martin looked at the shattered photo, his face grimmer than ever. He bent down, picked up a shard of the picture, and murmured, "This is not a good sign." He turned to look at Abigail, his voice calm but full of warning. Perhaps Benjamin's soul has not yet found peace, but it could also be that it's not him, but something else, an evil entity that has borrowed his form to return. Father Martin explained that when someone dies suddenly, their soul might get stuck between this world and the next, especially if they carry pain, regret, or an unfinished task. However, there are also malevolent entities, wandering spirits, that exploit the vulnerability of newly deceased souls or grieving loved ones to fulfill their dark purposes. The call to "let's switch places" could be a code, an enticement, or even a curse. He cautioned Abigail to always be vigilant. He blessed the house again, placing more holy symbols around the doors and windows, and gave Abigail a small crucifix, reminding her and Ethan to always carry it with them. Father Martin also advised Abigail to seek help from more experienced individuals in dealing with supernatural phenomena if the strange occurrences continued. After Father Martin's cleansing ritual, the disturbances in Abigail's house seemed to have temporarily subsided. The footsteps in the attic were gone, and the doors no longer opened and closed by themselves. A temporary sense of peace enveloped the house, but for Ethan, the memory of that terrifying night remained deeply etched. He occasionally still dreamt of the field behind the house. In his dream, a tall figure, eyeless, always stood there in the darkness, murmuring hauntingly, "Let's switch places." That voice, even if only in a dream, was enough to wake Ethan with a start. His whole body trembling and soaked in sweat, Abigail and Ethan's lives gradually returned to a more normal rhythm. They tried to forget that fateful seventh night, trying to believe that what had happened was just a result of grief and stress. Abigail tried to create a happier atmosphere for Ethan, taking him out to play, telling jokes. But deep down, she could not entirely shake off the fear. She knew that something had visited her home, and it could return at any time. 2 years later, summer of 2000, Ethan was now 8 years old. He was taller, more agile, and the psychological scars from that terrifying night had faded somewhat. He still remembered his father, but the grief no longer tormented him as it once had. Life in Ellsworth passed peacefully, except for the occasional nightmares of the field and the eyeless shadow that still visited Ethan. It was a late summer twilight, the last rays of sunlight receding behind the old maple and oak trees, casting a yellowish-gray glow over the backyard. The humid summer air still lingered, but gentle breezes from the field had begun to carry the chill of approaching autumn. Abigail was preparing dinner for herself and her son. She was about to simmer chicken bones for Ethan's favorite soup when she realized she was missing a large pot. The old one had been permanently damaged in a small accident a few months prior. "Ethan, wait for me in the yard. I'm going to borrow a large pot from Mrs. Beatrice Thorne," Abigail called out. Mrs. Beatrice was a kind neighbor, whose house was not far away on Maple Street. Ethan, curious by nature and unwilling to leave his mother, immediately got up from his puzzle game. He scampered after her, his bare feet treading on the soft grass, his small footsteps creating a gentle rustling sound. Abigail knew her son was following her, but she said nothing, just smiled faintly. She never imagined that such a peaceful afternoon could harbor a terrifying nightmare about to unfold. As Abigail stepped onto Mrs. Thorne's porch, the friendly greetings between the two women were suddenly interrupted by a piercing, high-pitched scream, echoing from beyond the gate. Ethan's shriek, "Mommy, help me!" Abigail spun around, her face momentarily surprised. She saw no one. Ethan's small figure had vanished from her sight. She paused for a few seconds, her heart beating a little faster. She thought her son was playing a trick on her, playing hide-and-seek as he often did, a game Ethan loved, a logical thought to soothe the initial anomaly. She squinted, looking around, intending to find where Ethan was hiding to give him a fright. Mrs. Thorne merely frowned slightly, then continued her unfinished conversation. As children in the village often played pranks like that, Abigail tried to ignore the creeping sense of unease, believing Ethan was just being mischievous. At the same moment, not far away, behind a thick, overgrown hydrangea bush at the fence in Mrs. Thorne's garden, Ethan was being held tightly. Something invisible, a bone-chilling, cold presence, suddenly enveloped the boy. Ethan felt a powerful, unseen force pulling him deeper into the bush, forcing him to sink to his knees. Simultaneously, he felt an ice-cold, invisible hand clamped tightly over his mouth, preventing him from screaming, from calling for help. The hand was frigid, as if sculpted from frost, and its long, iron-hard fingers lightly touched his neck, making him shiver. The damp, rotten smell of decaying earth and dead leaves assailed Ethan's nostrils, mingling with a strange, pungent, metallic scent, like dried blood. Ethan peered through the leaves of the hydrangea bush. He saw his mother and Mrs. Thorne still talking on the porch. Completely oblivious to what was happening, he tried to struggle, tried to scream, but it was useless. The only sound he could make was a muffled gasp. He felt utterly helpless, a puppet manipulated by an unseen, malevolent force. A chilling breath exhaled onto the back of his neck, like a long, heavy sigh, making the hairs on his nape stand on end. A raspy, deep voice whispered right into his ear, bone-chillingly cold, carrying a strange, perverse delight. Don't be afraid. You'll get used to it. A shrill, horrifying laugh hissed afterward, like metal scraping against metal, or bones clattering. You're good at hiding, Ethan. But today it's my turn to hide. And you stay. The boy struggled desperately, but in vain. Hot tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with the dirt clinging to his small face. Ethan's fear was no longer the fear of abandonment or of the dark. It was pure panic, the horror of realizing he had been severed from reality, as if his soul had been erased from his body, from this existence. He felt utterly helpless, a puppet manipulated by an unseen, malevolent force. He felt as if something was trying to pull his consciousness from his body. Light and cold, the pungent smell of decaying earth and rotten leaves became even more intense. On his skin, especially on his arms and legs, red marks began to appear as if someone was drawing ancient, complex symbols with sharp fingernails, with strange, swirling lines. They glowed faintly in the dark, forming bizarre shapes, then suddenly faded, vanishing as if they had never existed, leaving only a burning sensation. Ethan tried to move, but his body felt petrified. The voice spoke again, this time closer, as if it were whispering directly into Ethan's mind, piercing through every layer of protection. Your father didn't escape either. Now it's your turn. Ethan shuddered. He remembered his father's eyes in the blurry photo that night. The whispered, "Let's switch places," from the field. The feeling of his body being confined in the bedroom. It all returned like a continuous nightmare. A series of terrifying events that the boy had tried to bury. A cold current ran down his spine, making him shiver uncontrollably. He felt a great pressure on his chest, as if someone was standing on him. But he saw nothing but the surrounding hydrangea leaves. Having borrowed the necessary pot and exchanged a few more intimate stories with Mrs. Thorne about the upcoming harvest and the health of the villagers, Abigail finally returned home. By now, the last light of dusk had completely faded, and night had fallen, enveloping the town of Ellsworth in a terrifying silence. Abigail stepped into the kitchen, placing the pot on the table. Just a few minutes later, as she prepared to put the pot on the stove, she suddenly realized something strange. Ethan still wasn't home. A sense of unease crept into her mind, starting as a small speck and rapidly spreading, like a malignant tumor. It was past 7 o'clock. Her boy usually never stayed away from his mother for so long, especially in the evening. Abigail's heart pounded, its beats fast and strong like a drum roll. She called her son's name. "Ethan, where are you? Come home, darling." Her voice began to show a hint of worry, but the only reply was the incessant chirping of crickets from the nearby Elmwood field and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Her heart began to burn. The earlier feeling of worry now transformed into true fear, a cold dread invading her entire body. She rushed outside, searching her small garden, then moving to the dirt path. "Ethan, where are you? My love." Her voice began to tremble, cracking with desperation, her mournful cries tearing through the silent night. She asked passers-by, but no one had seen Ethan since he had followed her to Mrs. Thorne's house. Some of the older, more experienced villagers had also sensed an unusual energy in the air, an eerie silence unlike the usual calm of Ellsworth. They truly began to feel concerned. Panic erupted in Abigail. Everything seemed to collapse before her eyes. She began to sob uncontrollably, her desperate cries echoing in the quiet night of Ellsworth, attracting the attention of those around. Close neighbors, hearing Abigail's frantic calls, quickly grabbed flashlights, lanterns, and sticks, splitting up to search for the missing boy. Beams of light from the flashlights swept across the bushes, the small paths, and the dark gardens, creating dancing streaks of light in the darkness, but yielding no trace, sitting in the dense hydrangea bush, held captive by the invisible force. Ethan witnessed it all. He saw his mother, her face streaked with tears, screaming his name in despair, like a ghostly figure wandering in the night. He saw the neighbors with their lanterns searching, their lights sweeping over him, shining directly into his eyes, yet they passed through him as if he were invisible. They walked straight through him as if he didn't exist, as if he had been erased from this world. Ethan tried to scream, tried to wave, tried to move, but his body remained immobile, his mouth still covered. Hot tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with the dirt covering his face. A terrifying despair enveloped the 8-year-old boy's mind. It seemed to want to play with him, to possess his body to carry out this cruel game of hide-and-seek. Ethan felt a chilling current slowly permeate his body, from his feet to his head, like a stream of ice water flowing through his veins. He felt his mind become hazy, his consciousness seemingly pulled away from his body. This force didn't just want to hold him, it wanted to possess him. The boy weakly resisted, but there seemed to be no hope. Nearly 3 hours passed in chaos and despair. The whole village had searched everywhere, from the main road to the small paths leading to the Elmwood field, but there was no trace of Ethan. Abigail was on the verge of collapsing. She sat on the ground in front of Mrs. Thorne's house, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with convulsive sobs that tore through the air. Around 9 o'clock, when all hope seemed lost, Mrs. Martha Simmons, the oldest resident of the village, with white hair neatly pinned up and deep, experienced eyes, approached Abigail. She placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice calm but firm, carrying a hint of mystery. "Abigail, go to St. Jude's Church at the end of the village. Find Father Thomas. Only he can help you now. There are things that humans cannot explain, and there are forces that only faith can confront." Though she didn't fully understand Mrs. Martha's words, in her utter despair, Abigail clung to this last glimmer of hope like a drowning person clinging to a life raft. She stood up, her legs trembling, and hurried towards the church, where a faint yellow light shone through the stained glass windows, like a beacon in the gloomy night, a symbol of hope and sanctuary. About 30 minutes later, Abigail returned with Father Thomas O'Connell. He was a man in his mid-60s, with a benevolent face but eyes full of wisdom and determination, exuding an unusual sense of solemnity and calm. He wore the characteristic black cassock of the church, holding an Old Testament Bible and an oak rosary. Each bead smoothed by time, Father Thomas said little. He walked directly to Mrs. Thorne's garden, where everyone was still gathered. Searching for Ethan, he stopped in front of the dense hydrangea bush where Ethan was being held captive. A strange, pure, and powerful energy emanated from the priest, making the air around him seem heavier, as if an invisible battle was taking place. Even the villagers standing nearby felt a shiver run down their spines. Not from fear, but from a strong supernatural sensation. He closed his eyes, raised the Bible, and began to chant solemnly. ancient Latin prayers echoing in the still night of Ellsworth. Exorcizamus te, omnis immundus spiritus, omnis satanica potestas, omnis incurriso infernalis adversari, omnis legio, omnis congregatio et secta diabolica, utsis liberatus a maligno spiritu, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. We cast you out, every impure spirit, every satanic power, every incursion of the infernal adversary, every legion, every congregation and diabolical sect, that you may be freed from the evil spirit. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. As the prayers resonated, the air around the bush seemed to become chaotic. Gusts of wind suddenly rose from nowhere, swirling dry leaves in the air, like a small whirlwind. The dense hydrangea bush shook violently, its branches clashing together, creating dry, eerie sounds. A faint hiss, like wind blowing through a narrow crack, emanated from within the bush, a furious cry of something invisible being forced to leave. Then came an invisible, piercing scream that tore through the night, making those standing nearby shiver. And then, as if an invisible curtain had been torn, or an invisible string had been cut, Ethan burst out of the bush, throwing himself into his mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The boy didn't care about the surprised looks, the sighs of relief from everyone, or the coldness of the night. All he wanted was to be held by his mother, to feel the warmth and safety of her embrace. Ethan cried, as he had never cried before. He screamed in horror, recounting what had happened, though his words were choked by sobs and extreme fear. On his arms were faint bloodstains from scratches by thorns. But the mysterious, glowing marks had completely disappeared. Abigail hugged her son tightly, her own tears flowing. She stroked Ethan's disheveled hair, whispering comforting words. Father Thomas stood up, his face clearly showing exhaustion but also deep satisfaction. He knew he had won a battle, though only temporarily, and that this might not be the last time. Everyone brought Ethan and his mother home, Mrs. Beatrice Thorne, the neighbor, along with Mrs. Edna Harper and a few other villagers. No one wanted to leave Abigail and Ethan alone. They lit more candles, hung crucifixes around Abigail's windows and doors, like shields against evil, and in the sound of the wind whistling through the roof, a cold, threatening whisper seemed to linger, carrying anger and a promise of revenge. You're good at hiding, but next time, I'll find you. This incident deeply imprinted itself on Ethan's mind, an invisible scar that time would find hard to erase. The boy now carried a vague fear of the dark, of dense bushes, and of inexplicable things. He knew that the force that had haunted him, that had tried to possess his body, was still out there, still lurking. By 2007, 16-year-old Ethan was a tall, sturdy teenager with a calm demeanor and an early maturity. His deep blue eyes, however, still held the haunting memories of Elmwood Field and the eyeless shadow. Those memories were like an invisible scar, throbbing whenever darkness fell. Though Ethan had tried to hide his fear and live a normal life, a chilling sensation still crawled up his spine when he was alone in the dark, signaling that something sinister was lurking. After years without any significant supernatural occurrences, Abigail believed the curse had ended. She thought Father Thomas's cleansing rituals and prayers had worked, and that the malevolent spirit had released her son. She even had Ethan move back into his old second-floor bedroom, hoping the change of space would help him forget the terrifying past. But Ethan knew better. He clearly felt this silence was only on the surface, like a thin layer of ice covering a deep, frozen lake. The entity was still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment. And that moment arrived on a Christmas night, deep in the winter of 2007. It was a bitterly cold night, with wind whistling through cracks in the doors, carrying the first white snowflakes of the season. Snow had fallen thickly since the afternoon, blanketing Ellsworth in a picturesque yet gloomy stillness. The roads were deserted, every house glowed with lights, and the festive warmth of the holiday permeated the air. Except for Abigail's house, she was still in Denver, visiting a gravely ill relative. Only late that evening did she call, telling Ethan to cook himself some noodles for dinner and go to bed early. As she would be home late, Ethan, then 16, was alone in the quiet house. He wasn't afraid. Most of the town's kids were out playing or gathered at the church to sing familiar Christmas carols. But not Ethan. He was too used to being alone. He felt lonely but not sad. Knowing his mother would be home, Ethan decided to sit in the living room, reading a horror novel to pass the time while waiting for his mother. The faint yellow light from the old desk lamp wasn't enough to dispel the deep shadows within the house. Ethan poured himself a hot glass of milk and ate some cookies Mrs. Edna had brought over that afternoon. He wanted to stay awake, to avoid falling asleep and having nightmares. Suddenly, Ethan heard a clattering sound from the back of the house, a small noise, but clear enough to reach him in the silent space. He startled, vaguely guessing what was happening. The clattering grew clearer, like someone scratching at the old wooden wall, right next to the locked back door of the shed. Then, a decisive click echoed, like an old lock springing open, though this door had been securely fastened with an iron chain and a large padlock for years because the shed was rarely used, and Abigail feared Ethan's curiosity. Ethan still knew that the unwelcome presence had returned. He felt a sudden rush of cold air from the back of the house, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and a peculiar, pungent smell. Exactly like the one he'd smelled in the hydrangea bush 8 years ago. He didn't need to look, nor did he need to ask. Ethan knew. It wasn't footsteps, it wasn't whispering. It was just a heavy sensation, a dark presence enveloping the space. It was like a formless shadow, gliding through the darkness. Slowly approaching Ethan, no sound was made. But Ethan clearly felt its movement. Each time it drew closer. The air in the room grew colder, and the candles on the small altar in the living room flickered wildly on their own, then extinguished. Only the weak, wavering light of the desk lamp remained. Ethan stood up, his hand clutching the book he was reading. He felt his body tremble, but not from fear. It was a bone-chilling cold, an indescribable paralysis. He knew he couldn't run. This time, it would end. The invisible shadow stopped about 10 paces from Ethan. He squinted into the void before him, trying to discern a shape, an outline. But there was nothing. Just a region of space denser than the surrounding darkness. A void in reality, and then a voice echoed, not from in front of him, but from within his own mind, like a reverberation from a bottomless abyss. The voice was still hoarse and deep, but now it carried a macabre delight and a terrifying power Ethan had never heard before. You think you can escape me? Ethan, you think a few prayers and some holy water can drive me away? Naive, the chilling. Shrill laughter echoed again, not from a mouth but seeming to resonate from the walls, the floor, from the house itself, like bones clattering together. like hundreds of souls groaning in agony. Your father's soul, it's here with me. And now, it's your turn. Ethan's head reeled. He tried to step back, but his feet felt frozen to the floor. He felt a terrifying pressure on his chest, as if someone was squeezing his heart. The cold air grew stronger and stronger, wrapping around Ethan, constricting him, pulling him towards it. In that moment, a flash of insight ignited in Ethan's mind. He remembered Mrs. Edna's stories of trapped souls, of those who sought to claim the lives of others. He recalled Benjamin's empty eyes in the shattered wedding photo, and Father Martin's explanation. Benjamin had no eyes. Could it be? Benjamin wasn't Benjamin. Ethan took a deep breath. The fear was still there, but now, a cold anger had replaced it. He couldn't let himself be consumed like Benjamin. You are not my father, Ethan bellowed, his voice breaking in the night, stronger than he expected. You are an abomination. You took him, though Ethan's words were full of indignation and resolve. They weren't enough to drive away the evil. Instead, they seemed only to infuriate it further. A wave of chilling air, many times colder, suddenly rushed in, coiling around Ethan like an invisible rope. Tightening its grip, Ethan's eyes glazed over, his body stiffened, and his head tilted unnaturally to the side. A faint, almost imperceptible gray mist began to seep from his mouth, swirling as if being drawn into the dark void before him. His eyes, once bright blue, became dull and vacant, fixed on nothing. The book slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the floor. He was struggling, a silent, internal battle. His consciousness, his very self, was being tugged, pulled away, dissolving. He could feel it, a chilling void opening within him as the shadow's essence began to seep in. A feeling of being consumed, erased, just as Ethan's body sagged, on the verge of collapsing completely. The front door burst open. Abigail stood there, her face drawn from the long drive. But her eyes instantly widened in horror at the scene before her. She saw her son, his body limp and unresponsive, a faint mist escaping his lips, his eyes empty. She felt the sudden, crushing cold and the suffocating presence of something utterly evil in that instant. A mother's instinct, raw and powerful, surged through Abigail, overriding all fear. Her gaze swept to the small oak crucifix on the living room altar that Father Martin had given her years ago. She lunged for it, grasping the aged wood tightly in her hand. Leave my son, Abigail's voice, usually soft, thundered through the room, filled with a primal, protective fury. She raised the crucifix, pointing it directly at the invisible shadow that was tormenting her son. As she did, the crucifix in her hand began to glow with a fierce, ethereal light, a blinding pure white that pulsed with warmth and power. This light was not merely illumination. It carried a sacred, warm energy, a complete antithesis to the cold of the darkness. The light burst forth, powerfully tearing through the suffocating gloom in the room. A piercing, horrifying shriek erupted, not a human cry, but the shriek of something ancient, malevolent, being burned. Annihilated by the pure light, thick gray smoke billowed from where the dark entity stood, swirling in the cold air, carrying the smell of sulfur and death. The space around it distorted. The walls seemed to contract, and objects in the living room shook violently. As if struck by an earthquake, the shadow recoiled, emitting agonizing, furious hisses. The light from Abigail's crucifix grew so powerful that the room suddenly became bright as day, dispelling every hidden corner, every shadow where the evil had lurked. "Get out, I command you! Get away from my son! Get out of this house! Get out of our lives!" Abigail screamed, swinging the crucifix, pushing back the dark entity that was trying to cling to Ethan. Every word she uttered was like a knife plunging into it, every ray of light like a searing flame. Finally, with one last shriek that tore through the quiet Christmas night of Ellsworth, the dark shadow was fully repelled. It shot out through the mysteriously open window, vanishing into the cold night, leaving no trace but a lingering scent of burnt sulfur and residual coldness. The light from the crucifix slowly faded. Ethan gave a sharp gasp, jolting upright and collapsing into his mother's arms. He was panting, his eyes tear-filled but now clear, no longer vacant. He trembled, drenched in cold sweat. But he was back when Ethan finally calmed down in his mother's arms. He looked at her with exhausted but clear eyes. He recounted everything, every horrifying detail of losing himself, of feeling his soul being pulled away. Abigail listened, her face shifting from worry to horror, and finally to profound relief. She didn't doubt a single word. Her maternal instinct told her that her son's words were true. Abigail looked around the old house. Every nook and cranny held painful memories and lingering dread. She understood that as long as they stayed here, on this land, Benjamin's spirit and that malevolent shadow would never truly leave them alone. The fear had eaten too deeply into their lives. "We're leaving, Ethan," Abigail said, her voice firm, though still trembling slightly. "We're leaving Ellsworth, leaving this place, far away." Ethan looked at his mother, his eyes showing no surprise. Instead, a glimmer of hope sparked within them. He nodded. It was the only way to break this cycle. In the following weeks, Abigail moved quickly. She sold the old house for a pittance, caring nothing for profit, only wanting to escape as quickly as possible. She didn't elaborate on what had happened to the buyers, simply stating she wanted a fresh start elsewhere. Mrs. Edna and Father Thomas helped them wholeheartedly, silently understanding that this was the best choice. Abigail and Ethan decided to move to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, a place of majestic mountains and vast oceans. Thousands of miles from the desolate cornfields of Ellsworth, they found a new home, small and cozy, located in a bustling neighborhood with friendly neighbors and bright lights at night. There were no wild fields, no old sheds, no lurking shadows outside the windows. A new life began. Ethan quickly adapted to his new school, made friends, and engaged in sports. He still kept the old novel, but now it was safely tucked away in a keepsake box, no longer on his bedside table. The book became a symbol of his courage, his victory over fear, and a reminder that even when direct battle isn't possible, one can find liberation and start anew. Years passed. Ethan grew up, went to college, and started his own family. He never forgot Benjamin, but now, the image of his kind father, with his warm smile, returned to his mind, no longer obscured by the eyeless shadow or haunting whispers, though the town of Ellsworth remained peaceful after that Christmas night. No one ever heard footsteps in the attic or doors opening and closing on their own again. Benjamin's scent no longer wafted through the old house. The house was sold, and to the locals. It became a whispered tale of something not quite right that had once happened there. But no one dared to speak of it openly. Ethan sometimes still looked up at the night sky, wondering if the entity was still in Elmwood, or if it had moved on to seek new victims. But he was no longer afraid. He knew that Benjamin had found peace, somehow. And so had he. Through acceptance and decisive departure, Elmwood Field and its mysteries were left behind, becoming a part of the past. A horror story he had survived to tell.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Tina Shadow Stories so you don't miss our next chilling tales. See you in the next video.